candlelight flickers against the stone wall, a trembling little flame that seems too small for the darkness it's fighting. You're sitting there in a chamber where the air smells faintly of smoke, wax, and old sweat. Like every secret has left a trace. Somewhere down the hall you hear footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing like the heartbeat of a place where punishment is not just imagined but lived. You shift, uneasy, because the stories you're about to step into are not kind ones. They're stories of how human societies have taken the most intimate part of a body and turned it into a battlefield. And you probably won't survive this, at least not with your comfort intact, because every method you'll hear about tonight is darker, stranger, and more unsettling than you can imagine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is where you are. I love seeing the world mapped out in sleepy little dots of night owls. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You close your eyes and the chamber dissolves, giving way to the world's first cities, Mesopotamia, where temple towers rise like staircases to the gods. Here, castration wasn't always about cruelty. It was about access. In Sumerian temples, eunuchs were fashioned not from accident or misfortune, but through deliberate ritual. To lose what defined your manhood was to gain entry into sacred roles. You imagine the hush of a ziggurat hall, incense curling into the air, and priests chanting as another boy's fate is sealed. The society around him believed he had been made pure, a servant not of family or ambition, but of divine order. Historians still argue whether this practice began as devotion, or as a convenient form of social control. Some suggest the gods demanded such sacrifices, while others note how convenient it was for temple hierarchies to create men with no heirs, no dynasties, and no distractions beyond their duties. Either way, the result was the same. Temples filled with those who had been reshaped to serve. They guarded treasures, sang hymns, and stood at the elbows of priests and rulers. The cost was enormous, yet the prestige, at least within the walls of faith, was undeniable. Imagine the daily rhythm of such a man, his mornings marked not by family life, but by ritual washing. His evenings lit not by hearth fires, but by sacred flames. The body altered, the destiny sealed, he became a permanent reminder that power and belief could demand the most personal sacrifices. The mainstream fact remains. Records from Ur and Babylon explicitly note the presence of eunuchs, temple servants who became indispensable. But the fringe tidbit lingers in whispered possibilities. Were some of these sacrifices voluntary, boys or men offering themselves in devotion? Or were they chosen, taken, reshaped without voice or choice? The walls of that first chamber you imagined grow colder now. You lean back, and the silence of the ages hums around you. The notion that civilization itself was built in part by those who had been altered, that the great cities of Mesopotamia ran smoother because certain men were cut away from the cycle of inheritance and family, settles uneasily. Humanity's first organized societies knew the sharp edge of ritual, and they left no doubt that to serve the gods sometimes meant surrendering what made you most human. The chamber of memory shifts, and you find yourself walking under the painted eaves of an imperial palace. The walls are high, gilded with dragons and clouds, and every doorway seems to whisper secrets of power. You're in China, where emperors claim to rule by the mandate of heaven, and where some of the most powerful men in the Forbidden City were men who had been unmade. Eunuchs, thousands of them, filled the palace corridors, their soft shoes gliding silently over stone floors, their hands clasped in perfect obedience. You might think they were powerless, but in reality, they often held keys to influence that generals and scholars could only dream of. The mainstream fact here is simple. For over 1,000 years, eunuchs were central to Chinese dynastic politics. They were personal attendants, imperial messengers, even administrators of vast projects. Their unique status made them indispensable, because without heirs, they could be trusted not to form rival dynasties. In theory, their loyalty belonged entirely to the emperor, but in practice, these unmade men often became power brokers, whispering into the emperor's ear and controlling access to the throne itself. You picture the palace at dawn, its courtyards sweeping wide, filled with the rustle of silk robes. Eunuchs would rise before the emperor, preparing scrolls, ensuring the kitchen simmered with delicacies, managing the endless tide of concubines, servants, and spies. To be without manhood meant, paradoxically, to be trusted near the emperor's women, That closeness gave them influence, and influence bred danger. Historians still argue whether eunuchs were the saviours or the ruin of Chinese dynasties. Some accounts describe them as loyal guardians who protected the emperor from corrupt officials, while others paint them as schemers who toppled dynasties with their intrigues. One quirky tidbit: in some cases eunuchs preserved what had been taken. A eunuch's severed parts, known in slang as bao, the treasure, were sometimes pickled and kept in a jar. Why? Because at death, Chinese tradition demanded a whole body to face the afterlife. Without his treasure, a eunuch risked wandering the next world incomplete, so jars of hidden flesh followed these men for decades, a grotesque reminder of the price they'd paid for power. Imagine standing in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, sunlight slanting through vermilion beams, and realizing that the man announcing imperial decrees might be a eunuch who had risen from poverty into near absolute authority. Yet the same man could vanish overnight, executed for corruption or betrayal, his palace apartments sealed, his name blackened forever. There was no safe position, only the dangerous balance of trust and fear. As you walk the corridors of that palace in your mind, you can almost hear the whisper of silk, the cough of an aged eunuch, the scrape of brushes on scrolls. The Forbidden City, glittering with gold, was also built on whispered deals, manipulation, and the hidden pain of thousands of men reshaped by knife and fire. The sheer scale is staggering. Records suggest tens of thousands of eunuchs served across dynasties, from the Han to the Ming. Some became revered, others reviled, but all lived with bodies forever marked by a system that turned castration into an institution. The palace fades slowly, the dragons on its walls dissolving into smoke, but the echo of its eunuchs lingers. They were both the most trusted and the most feared of servants, men who proved that power in history often required a sacrifice more permanent than loyalty alone. The stone corridors of Beijing's palace dissolve into colder shadows, and you find yourself standing beneath a dome of mosaics, gold and lapis glittering faintly in lamplight. This is Byzantium, the empire of shifting crowns and endless plots, where power was never secure and betrayal was always a breath away. Here, castration became not sacred duty or palace institution, but weapon. When a rival threatened your throne, you didn't always kill him. Sometimes you made sure he could never rule, and you did it in a way that reminded everyone else what crossing you would cost. In Byzantine law and custom, the emperor was supposed to embody a complete man, whole in body as well as spirit. So, if a rival claimant to the throne was captured, blinding or castration was often chosen as punishment. Death could make a martyr, but mutilation made a warning. Imagine the clatter of chains as a rival prince is dragged into a dim chamber, his eyes covered, knowing that by morning he would emerge unfit for both crown and family. The mainstream fact here is that mutilation was political currency. Eunuchs in Byzantium weren't just the powerless servants of earlier traditions. They could climb the hierarchy of church and state, serving as generals, treasurers, even patriarchs of the Orthodox Church. Some of the most trusted court officials were eunuchs, because like in China, they had no dynasties of their own to establish. They became instruments of imperial power. But historians still argue whether castration as punishment was always effective. Did it really prevent rivals from seizing the throne, or did it just harden rebellions? Some cases suggest that a blinded, mutilated rival still managed to rally followers. Their suffering turned into a symbol of divine injustice. The empire, with its endless intrigues, was never fully secured by the knife. One strange, almost fringe tidbit: Byzantine medicine had its own manuals for how to perform castration with the least chance of death. Some sources hint that snow, wine, or even crushed herbs were applied to stanch blood and reduce fever. It's unsettling to think of surgeons perfecting methods not to heal, but to ensure that the punishment stuck without killing the subject too quickly. After all, a dead rival couldn't be paraded through the streets as proof of your dominance. You picture a dim cathedral hall, candles smoking as a eunuch official kneels before the emperor. His robes shimmer with embroidery. His voice is sharp and commanding, yet beneath it all lies the memory of a punishment that turned him into a tool of empire. He cannot have sons, he cannot wear the crown, but he can manage armies and decide the fate of provinces. His body is proof of loss, but his presence is proof of survival. As you walk through those corridors in your imagination, the air grows tight with incense and conspiracy. Every shadow could hide a plot. every silence could conceal a eunuch official calculating whether to protect or betray the man on the throne. Byzantium reminds you that castration wasn't always about taking away. It was also about transforming, redirecting ambition into channels that served the empire. But the cost was brutal, and the memory of iron chains and whispered punishments never faded. The golden mosaics shimmer once more, then fade to black, leaving you with the uneasy awareness that in this empire, even survival meant mutilation, and that the path to power was paved with sacrifices no one would choose. The glittering domes of Byzantium dissolve into desert winds, and the echo of minarets calling across a city at dawn. You've slipped into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, where marble palaces rise from the Bosporus and the scent of spices clings to the air. Behind the carved gates of Topkapi Palace lies the most secretive and feared institution of all, the imperial harem. And guarding its labyrinth of chambers, silken draperies and jewelled courtyards were men who had once been boys, reshaped by blades to ensure their loyalty and their harmlessness, white eunuchs. The mainstream fact is striking. At the height of Ottoman power, thousands of eunuchs served in the palace. Two main groups existed: the black eunuchs, often taken from Africa and stationed within the inner harem as guardians of concubines, and the white eunuchs, largely Christian boys from the Balkans who guarded the outer courts and acted as gatekeepers to the Sultan himself. To approach the ruler, you often had to pass through the watchful eyes of men who had sacrificed, or been forced to sacrifice, their manhood. You imagine the sound of sandals shuffling on tiled floors, the rattle of keys hanging from a eunuch's belt, the hush of silk as women moved behind lattice screens. In the harem's golden light, lives were tightly controlled. To prevent even the possibility of scandal or heirs outside the Sultan's line, the empire relied on mutilation as policy. Historians still argue whether these eunuchs were primarily victims or wielders of enormous influence. After all, some of them rose to become confidants of sultans, managers of the harem, even political actors in the succession of heirs. A curious tidbit emerges in old accounts. Many of these eunuchs underwent castration far from Istanbul, sometimes in rough border villages, and only those who survived the dangerous procedure were brought to the capital. Mortality rates were high, and yet those who lived could find themselves clothed in fine garments, serving at the very centre of imperial life. Imagine the strange irony. One boy dies nameless in a back room, while his companion becomes the man holding the palace's most important keys. The corridors of Topkapi were not quiet. Behind the intricate latticework, concubines whispered about who might gain the Sultan's favour. Eunuchs were their protectors, but also their wardens, ensuring the harem functioned as a machine of dynastic power. You picture the solemn face of a white eunuch as he bows before a visiting ambassador, reminding the world that no one reached the Sultan without passing through him. His absence of heirs made him paradoxically more reliable than generals with sons waiting in the wings. Historians note that in some cases eunuchs managed estates, commanded soldiers, or even arranged marriages for concubines who fell out of favour. Their influence spread beyond the harem into the arteries of empire. But always, beneath the embroidery and gold, lay the memory of an act that had torn away their bodies to secure the empire's order. You feel the marble floors cool beneath your feet as you imagine walking those palace halls. The laughter of concubines filters faintly from behind screens. The scrape of a eunuch's slippers passes close, and the scent of rosewater lingers in the air. Yet beneath the beauty lies a hard truth. The Ottoman harem, so often romanticised in paintings, was also a prison maintained by men whose very identities had been broken and reshaped for service. The palace dissolves into shadows once more, leaving behind the faint echo of jingling keys and the uneasy silence of men who lived their entire lives as both guardians and captives of a world built on control. The marble colonnades of Topkapi blur into rough-hewn stone streets, and suddenly you're standing in a medieval marketplace. The air is thick with smoke, roasting meat, and the sharp tang of tanned leather. Bells toll somewhere in the distance, summoning people not to prayer but to justice. For here, in the Middle Ages, castration wasn't just a tool of politics or empire, it was punishment, wielded like a hammer by lords, kings, and local courts. If you committed adultery, stole the wrong noble's horse, or conspired against the crown, your body could become the sentence. The mainstream fact is sobering. Legal codes from England to France to the German states prescribed castration as punishment for serious crimes. In some places it was paired with blinding, turning the convicted into living warnings of the law's reach. Picture a crowded square, villagers pressing close, the condemned bound to a post as the verdict is read aloud. The punishment wasn't carried out in secret, it was a spectacle. Justice was theatre, and your body was the stage. Historians still argue whether these punishments were consistently enforced or if they were more often threats, invoked to frighten communities into obedience. Some chroniclers describe men mutilated for betraying their lords. Others leave us only the laws, suggesting their use was rare but terrifyingly possible. Either way, the power of the punishment lay in its permanence. Unlike fines or floggings, this was irreversible. One strange tidbit emerges from medieval England. Some chronicles suggest that high-born men, when sentenced, might have their punishment symbolically carried out. Instead of mutilation, a mark might be made, or the sentence quietly commuted to exile. Meanwhile, peasants or commoners could expect no such mercy. Justice was flexible, but only for those who already lived in privilege. You walk through the square in your mind and the atmosphere feels almost festive. Children dart between the legs of onlookers, women whisper behind shawls, and hawkers sell food to the gathered crowd. There's a sickening normalcy to it, as if mutilation has become another form of entertainment. The condemned man stands pale and trembling, the air thick with anticipation. His crime might have been as intimate as adultery or as political as treason, but his punishment would be forever written on his body. The church often stood awkwardly nearby in these moments. Officially, it condemned unnecessary cruelty. Yet monasteries and bishops also recognized castration as a way to cleanse sin through suffering. A man punished this way might be urged to dedicate the rest of his life to God, barred from family and legacy, but pushed toward salvation. You can almost hear the echo of a monk chanting psalms as the crowd disperses, the sound carried like incense over cobblestones. Imagine walking home afterward. The square behind you quiet again. The scaffold dismantled, the ashes cooling, but the memory of what you saw burned into your mind. For the medieval world, punishment wasn't hidden in prisons, it was carved into the flesh of its people. And whether you were noble, knight, or farmer, you knew the threat was real. The torches sputter and fade in your vision, the laughter of the dispersing crowd dissolving into silence. Yet you carry with you the understanding that in the medieval world, law and cruelty walked hand in hand, and to cross the wrong boundary meant risking a punishment that no time could undo. The noisy medieval square fades into velvet curtains and candlelit chapels, where a different kind of sentence is passed, not by a judge, but by a music teacher with ambitions and a knife. You've stepped into Renaissance Europe, where art, faith, and cruelty often shared the same breath. Here, castration found a strangely celebrated role, preserving the voices of boys so they could soar in choirs and opera houses as castrati. The thought alone feels chilling, that the price of angelic song was permanence of silence elsewhere. The mainstream fact is hard to ignore. From the 16th to the 18th centuries, thousands of boys were castrated across Italy and beyond. Families, sometimes desperately poor, agreed to the procedure in hopes their sons might rise to fame and wealth. The Catholic Church banned women from singing in choirs, and so castrati filled the gap, their voices combining the purity of a child's high notes with the lung power of a grown man. Audiences swooned, kings applauded. Yet behind the soaring arias was a surgery performed in shadow. Historians still argue whether the boys themselves ever had any say. Some records describe it as a choice presented by ambitious parents, others as procedures done without the child's knowledge until it was too late. The ambiguity lingers in the silence of history. Were these singers willing dreamers or unwilling sacrifices? A quirky tidbit surfaces in anecdote. Not every castrato became famous. In fact, most lived obscure lives, their altered voices confined to small choirs or parish churches. For every star like Farinelli, who could captivate Europe's courts, dozens languished in obscurity. Imagine the irony, an entire life reshaped for song, only to end in quiet anonymity. You step into an opera house in your imagination, velvet seats stretching in tears, chandeliers burning bright, the crowd buzzing in anticipation. When the castrato steps on stage, His voice unfurls like something unearthly, filling the hall with tones no natural singer could match. Some called it divine, others unsettling. And in that sound, audiences conveniently forgot the boyhood that had been taken to produce it. Daily life for these men was complicated. They lived marked by difference, not quite fitting into traditional roles, often mocked, sometimes revered. They trained relentlessly, mastering music theory, languages and performance. For the few who achieved fame, riches poured in, carriages, palaces, lovers, prestige. But for many more, their altered bodies became burdens in a world that treated them as curiosities once the music stopped. The church itself oscillated between awe and unease. Castrati voices were considered pure offerings to God, yet the means of producing them hovered uncomfortably close to sin. Some clerics defended the practice as necessary for sacred music, while others condemned it as cruelty dressed up in piety. The debate never fully settled, it simply faded as the age of castrati waned. As the final notes of an aria echo in your mind, you're left with a conflicted hush. The beauty of the sound was undeniable, but the silence that followed, what the singers themselves endured, was perhaps louder still. The opera house dims around you, its chandeliers fading, and you're left with the strange realization that some of history's most ethereal art was built on a foundation of irreversible sacrifice. The velvet curtains of the opera hall drift away, and you find yourself on a dusty caravan trail under a punishing sun. The air smells of sweat, dust, and fear. You're no longer in gilded Europe, but in the harsh trade routes of Africa and the Middle East, where castration was not about ritual purity or angelic voices, but about control, total, merciless control. Enslaved men, captured in raids or wars, were forced through brutal procedures before being sold across empires. Their altered bodies became commodities, and the scars of those choices lingered not just on individuals but across generations. The mainstream fact here is devastating. During the height of the Arab slave trade, many boys were castrated before being transported to serve in households, armies, or harems. Mortality rates were staggering. Some estimates suggest that only 1 in 10 survived the process. And yet, the survivors became highly valued, precisely because their condition made them seen as safe in roles close to women or rulers. Imagine being stripped of not just freedom, but family, legacy, and even the possibility of lineage. Historians still argue over the scale of this practice. Some emphasize that castration was widespread across centuries and regions. Others insist the numbers may have been exaggerated by European observers eager to demonize rival empires. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, with enough evidence to show it was real, frequent and horrific, but with the exact scope shrouded in incomplete records. One grim tidbit. Some castration centres reportedly operated like grim factories. Boys brought from sub-Saharan Africa were taken to outposts along the Nile or Red Sea, where crude operations were carried out. Survival meant a new life of servitude. Death meant burial in shallow, unmarked sand. The image is chilling. Lives weighed like cargo, their fate determined by a knife in a dim hut. You picture a slave market in Cairo, the sun blazing down on rows of men and boys standing silent, heads lowered. Among them are eunuchs, their value higher, their futures mapped out by masters who see them not as people but as tools. A merchant haggles, a buyer inspects teeth and posture, and the hum of commerce drowns out the screams that came before. For those who lived, survival sometimes meant unexpected power. Eunuchs in Islamic courts could rise to influential positions, managing harems, treasuries, or even armies. Like their counterparts in China and Byzantium, their inability to form dynasties made them convenient confidants. Yet that influence was born from trauma, and the contradiction is impossible to shake. Men destroyed in one way, elevated in another. You imagine the personal silence of such a man, standing guard in a palace, watching over concubines or princes, his thoughts perhaps drifting back to the village where he was born, the family he would never see again, the children he would never have. His body became a contract signed without his consent, binding him to servitude for life. The caravan trail stretches endlessly in your vision, sand swallowing the footprints behind. Each step is heavy with the knowledge that slavery's brutality wasn't limited to chains and whips. It reached deeper into the very essence of identity, reshaping bodies for the convenience of power. And though the sun sets and the desert wind cools, the echoes of that cruelty linger, whispering of lives rewritten by force and silence. The desert sands scatter into dust, and you awaken beneath the glow of electric lamps. The world is no longer medieval or imperial, it's modern, with brick hospitals, courtrooms, and laboratories humming with new kinds of authority. Castration, once carried out with crude knives in temples, palaces, and slave markets, takes on fresh disguises in the 20th century. No longer framed as sacred ritual or dynastic necessity, it is recast as punishment, medicine, or even science. The change in tools doesn't soften the reality. The scalpel may be cleaner, but the intent is often the same: control. The mainstream fact is stark. Chemical castration became a sanctioned practice in the 20th century. In places like the United States and Europe, it was prescribed as treatment for sex offenders, hailed by some as a humane alternative to prison. In reality, it was often coercive, with individuals pressured into compliance. The injection of hormones didn't involve knives, but it changed the body just as permanently, suppressing testosterone, reshaping desires, and branding men with a sentence written into their very cells. Historians still argue whether chemical castration was more punishment or medicine. Some claim it offered offenders a path back into society. Others point out how rarely consent was genuine when the choice was prison or injection. The debate grows thornier with time, especially when viewed against the backdrop of broader medical abuses in the 20th century. A quirky tidbit reveals itself in the story of Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician who cracked codes in World War II and helped shape the foundations of modern computing. When his homosexuality was criminalised in the 1950s Britain, he was forced into chemical castration. The irony is painful, one of history's greatest minds reshaped by the very state he had helped save. His story embodies the contradiction, science advancing, while society wielded its own science as punishment. You walk through a sterile hospital corridor in your imagination, the smell of disinfectant sharp, the buzzing of fluorescent lights overhead. In one room, a man signs papers he doesn't fully understand. In another, a doctor readies a syringe. There's no crowd here, no marketplace, no palace ceremony, just the quiet hum of bureaucracy. Yet the permanence of the act is no less chilling. Elsewhere, entire institutions turn to castration as part of eugenics programs. In the early 20th century, states like California sterilized thousands of men and women deemed unfit, their consent rarely sought. It wasn't called castration, but the logic was the same: cutting away fertility to control society's future. Imagine rows of forms stamped by clerks, the cold efficiency of paperwork deciding who could reproduce. And even in more recent decades, debates continue. Some courts still sentence offenders to chemical castration, while activists argue about whether it constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. The language changes: therapy, treatment, rehabilitation. But the shadow of history lingers. You can almost hear the echo of ancient chambers in every sterile office where such decisions are made. As you leave this imagined hospital, the automatic doors hiss open, spilling you into the night air. The stars overhead look no different from those that watched Mesopotamian rituals or Byzantine dungeons. The methods evolve, but the question remains: how far will societies go to reshape the body in the name of order? The hiss of those hospital doors gives way to silence, and now you're left in a quiet room where the walls seem to breathe with all the stories you've heard. The journey has carried you from temples to palaces, from opera houses to deserts, and into the halls of modern medicine. But the truth is, castration has never fully disappeared. It lingers in today's world, tucked into debates about justice, punishment, and even ethics. The shadows of history stretch farther than you think, and they reach right into the present. The mainstream fact is unsettling. In some countries, chemical castration remains a legal sentence for certain sex crimes. Judges still order injections of hormone-blocking drugs as conditions for parole or reduced sentences. On paper, it sounds modern, clinical, almost progressive compared to prisons. But in practice, it echoes the same old pattern: society using the body as its canvas of control. You picture a judge's gavel falling, not with the clang of medieval justice, but with a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that masks how severe the punishment still is. Historians and ethicists still argue whether this is justice or cruelty repackaged. Does it rehabilitate, or does it cross into the same violations we condemned in the past? The debate is sharp, unresolved, and tinged with unease. After all, if modern society condemns the eunuch systems of old, can it truly defend its own chemical versions? A fringe tidbit creeps in here. In the late 20th century, some governments experimented with surgical castration of prisoners, advertising it as voluntary rehabilitation. In reality, the choice was stark: undergo the knife or face life in prison. Consent in such a context becomes a fragile, questionable thing. You can almost see the sterile operating room where a prisoner stares at the ceiling, aware that his so-called decision is more a sentence than a choice. Beyond prisons, echoes still appear in unexpected corners. Medical treatments for prostate cancer often rely on hormone suppression, effectively chemical castration, though framed as life-saving therapy. For the patient, the effects are the same: the body reshaped, hormones silenced. The line between punishment and medicine grows blurry, and society struggles to draw it clean. Imagine sitting in a courtroom where the air hums with tension. Lawyers argue about rights and safety. Families weep in the benches, and the man at the centre waits to hear whether his fate will be prison walls or injections that will hollow him out from within. The words are modern, the laws dressed in technical jargon, but the weight of history hangs heavily. It's the same old question. Can society justify carving away part of a man to maintain order? The eerie part is how quietly it all happens now. No public squares, no palace corridors, no caravan trails, just clinical offices, court documents, and the soft click of syringes. The world has grown quieter, but the practice persists, and in that quiet you feel the echoes of every voice before: temple eunuchs, imperial servants, punished traitors, enslaved guards, singers of impossible arias, all bound by a single thread of loss. As you sit in this room of silence, you realise the story has not ended. Castration's forms may have changed, but its shadow stretches into our own time, reminding you that the boundary between progress and cruelty is thinner than we like to admit. The courtroom dissolves, and you find yourself once more in that dim, candlelit chamber where the journey began. The air is heavier now, saturated with the weight of centuries, and you sit quietly, listening to the echoes of all the lives that pass before you. From the incense-thick temples of Sumer to the hushed corridors of the Forbidden City, from Byzantine dungeons to Ottoman harems, from the cruel spectacle of medieval justice to the velvet-wrapped opera houses of Europe, from slave markets in the desert to sterile hospitals in the 20th century, each place carried its own method, its own logic, its own justification. Yet the pattern remained the same: bodies taken, reshaped, silenced, and turned into instruments of power. The mainstream fact that lingers in this final reflection is that castration wasn't rare or fringe. It was a recurring thread across civilizations. Every culture that sought absolute control seemed to stumble toward the same practice, as if human societies could not resist rewriting biology to enforce obedience. And historians still argue whether the persistence of these practices reveals more about the cruelty of rulers or the desperation of systems trying to hold order together. A strange tidbit worth carrying with you: in some folklore, eunuchs were imagined as having mystical qualities, able to bridge male and female worlds, to serve as spiritual mediators. Their altered bodies became symbols not just of loss, but of strange liminal power. It is an odd comfort, perhaps, that some of those who suffered were at least seen as holding a unique place in the human imagination. You imagine leaning back against the stone wall, the flickering candlelight washing over your face, and realizing that the silence left behind by these men is as loud as any scream. Each story has been both a punishment and a paradox, stripping away power in one sense, only to grant influence in another. You recall the temple servants, the imperial whisperers, the courtly singers, the palace guards, the condemned criminals, the enslaved men, and even the modern prisoners, all bound together by a history no one chooses to inherit. The chamber grows softer now, the shadows less sharp, as if the centuries themselves are ready to rest. You feel the weight of all these stories settling into a hush, not to frighten, but to remind. Because what humanity has done in the name of order, beauty, or belief often leaves scars that whisper long after the knife is gone. And as the candle burns lower, you sense those whispers fading, replaced by something gentler, the steady rhythm of your own breath, the promise of sleep just beyond reach. So let the chamber dissolve fully now, the walls, the shadows, the whispers of history. Let them all soften into the quiet of your own room. The candlelight fades to nothing, replaced by the dim glow of whatever keeps you company tonight. Perhaps the soft hum of a fan or the distant murmur of traffic outside. You've carried the weight of dark stories, of punishments too intimate to imagine, but now it is time to put them down. Breathe slowly. Let the air settle in your chest like calm water. The men you've followed across centuries are no longer suffering. Their stories belong to the past, resting where history keeps all its ghosts. You, however, are safe here in this moment, with nothing demanded of your body, nothing reshaped, nothing taken. Just you, breathing, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of night. Let your thoughts drift to softer places. The rustle of leaves outside a window, the hush of waves against a shore, the warmth of blankets gathering around you. The world can be cruel, but it can also be gentle. Tonight you get to rest in the gentle. Close your eyes, let the silence cradle you, and drift into sleep.